I'm turning.
Put your hands behind your back. You're not walking away from the traffic stop. Put your hands behind your back.
You didn't.
Put your hands behind your back.
Please go.
Put your hands behind your back. Put your hands
me.
behind your back.
Put your hand.
Put your hands behind your back.
What is wrong?
Put your hand behind your back. Put your other hand behind your back. Put your other hand behind your back.
Wrong way.
The video opens not with investigation, not with explanation, but with command. The first seconds establish a tone of urgency and authority that leaves no room for dialogue. An officer issues rapid directives as the situation is framed as a traffic stop, even as the boundaries of that stop are still forming. What matters here is not the alleged violation, but control who has it, who is expected to submit to it, and how quickly defiance is interpreted as threat. From the very beginning, the officer treats the scene as one requiring immediate compliance. The driver exits her vehicle after pulling into a parking space, a choice that becomes the fulcrum for everything that follows. In many routine encounters, this moment would prompt clarification. Here, it prompts escalation. The officer does not slow the interaction down. Instead, commands multiply, volume increases, and the situation accelerates toward physical detention. This is the first critical inflection point. A traffic stop is, by law, a temporary seizure. It requires reasonable suspicion at initiation and remains limited in scope. The authority granted to the officer exists only so long as the stop itself is clearly communicated and lawfully maintained. But in this encounter, communication gives way to assertion. The officer insists that the stop is active, while the driver insists that she has parked. The law hinges on that distinction, yet no effort is made to resolve it verbally before force is introduced. What we see instead is a psychological pattern common in contentious stops. Perceived non-compliance becomes synonymous with wrongdoing. The driver's movement away from the vehicle is immediately characterized as resistance, even before any arrest has been announced. This is a subtle but consequential shift. Resistance is not defined by violence here, but by disobedience. The officer's commands become the metric by which legality is measured. As the driver continues to question the basis of the detention, the officer frames her actions as defiance. This framing matters. Once a subject is labeled as resisting, subsequent force is often justified retroactively. The camera captures a rapid sequence of physical directives: hands behind the back, repeated insistence, and physical positioning that leaves little room for voluntary compliance. The officer's focus is no longer on explaining the stop, but on asserting dominance over the encounter. This is where the power imbalance becomes unmistakable. The driver's protests are not met with clarification, but with repetition of commands. Her insistence that she has done nothing wrong is treated not as a claim to be evaluated, but as an obstacle to be overcome. The officer's language shifts from instructional to accusatory. Each refusal, real or perceived, tightens the loop. The moment the officer initiates physical control, the encounter crosses an invisible threshold. What began as a traffic-related interaction is now a custodial situation. Yet the justification for that transition remains contested. The officer repeatedly asserts that the driver cannot walk away from a traffic stop, while the driver disputes that characterization. This disagreement is never resolved in the moment. Instead, it is overridden by force. This is not an uncommon dynamic in bodycam footage, but it is one of the most revealing. Officers are trained to maintain control, but control without communication often produces the very resistance it claims to suppress. The driver's confusion is evident, but confusion is interpreted as willful disobedience. The officer's certainty becomes absolute, leaving no space for reconsideration. As backup is requested and the situation stabilizes physically, the narrative solidifies. The officer now speaks with the confidence of hindsight, asserting that everything is documented and that the justification for the stop is clear. This is a common rhetorical move. The camera becomes not a tool for transparency, but a shield against accountability. The implication is that the recording itself validates the officer's version of events, regardless of how the encounter unfolded. Once the driver is restrained, the officer begins to articulate the reasons for the stop. These reasons noise, a rolling stop are presented as settled facts. But the timing is critical. They are introduced after the arrest has effectively occurred, not before. This sequence matters legally and psychologically. Probable cause must precede arrest, not follow it. When justification is articulated only after force is used, It raises questions about whether the arrest was driven by evidence or by escalation. The driver continues to ask what she did wrong. This question goes unanswered in any meaningful way. Instead, the officer emphasizes her failure to comply. The original alleged violations fade into the background, replaced by a narrative centered on behavior during the encounter. This is another common pattern. The stop becomes self-justifying. The officer's authority is challenged, the challenge becomes resistance, and resistance becomes the primary offense. As the interaction progresses, the officer introduces additional observation: smell of alcohol, appearance, behavior. These claims expand the scope of the encounter dramatically. A stop that began with traffic-related allegations now includes suspicion of impaired driving. Again, the order is important. These observations are articulated after the driver has been detained, not as the basis for the initial stop or the initial use of force. This layering of justifications is not accidental. It reflects an institutional reality in which officers are encouraged to articulate probable cause in comprehensive terms, especially when an encounter has escalated. The more reasons that can be listed, the more defensible the arrest appears. But quantity does not equal quality. Each claimed observation must be evaluated in context, and context here is shaped by confrontation. The driver's refusal to participate in roadside tests is framed as further evidence of guilt. Legally, refusal can have consequences, but it is not, in itself, proof of impairment. The officer, however, treats it as confirmation. The arrest for driving under the influence is announced with finality, bundled together with the earlier accusation of resisting without violence. The narrative is now complete: a defiant driver, a lawful stop, escalating behavior, and inevitable arrest. Or so it is presented. What is striking is how little effort is made to de-escalate at any point. There is no pause to reset the interaction, no attempt to reframe the stop in calmer terms. Once the driver exits the vehicle, the officer's trajectory is fixed. This rigidity is often justified as officer safety, but it can also reflect a lack of adaptive communication skills. When authority is challenged, some officers respond not by clarifying, but by doubling down. The reading of rights marks a procedural shift. The officer adopts a more measured tone, explaining the charges and the process. This contrast is telling. Calmness returns only after control has been fully established. The earlier urgency, the repeated commands, the physical struggle, all of it gives way to explanation once resistance is no longer possible. This raises an uncomfortable question. Could this tone have been used earlier, before the encounter escalated? As the officer explains the alleged violations in detail, the narrative becomes increasingly specific. Observations about the driver's behavior, her vehicle, and her actions prior to the stop are recounted with confidence. Yet these details are filtered through the lens of an interaction that has already turned adversarial. Memory and perception are not static, they are influenced by emotion, stress, and justification. When an officer believes an arrest is necessary, subsequent observations often align with that belief. The mention of prior observation, seeing the driver earlier, noticing a drink, serves to bolster the officer's sense of certainty. It frames the stop not as a spontaneous reaction, but as the culmination of ongoing suspicion. This retrospective coherence can be persuasive, but it also obscures the reality that the arrest decision was made early, before many of these details were articulated. Throughout this first part of the video, the driver's voice is present but powerless. She asserts her innocence, questions the legality of the stop, and expresses confusion. None of these assertions alter the course of events. This asymmetry is the defining feature of the encounter. The officer's interpretation prevails not because it is tested and confirmed, but because it is enforced. The broader implications extend beyond this single stop. Encounters like this illustrate how easily the line between lawful authority and misuse of power can blur. When officers rely on compliance as the primary measure of legitimacy, any deviation becomes suspect. Citizens are expected to intuit the officer's expectations, even when those expectations are not clearly communicated. By the end of this segment, the outcome is no longer in doubt. The driver is under arrest, her vehicle is subject to further action, and the officer expresses confidence in the process ahead. The camera continues to record, but the critical moments, the decisions that shaped everything, have already passed. What remains is procedure. This first part of the documentary sets the stage for deeper analysis. It shows how quickly a routine encounter can escalate when authority is asserted without explanation and challenged without resolution. It reveals the psychological mechanics of escalation, the legal gray areas of traffic stops, and the human cost of rigid enforcement. Most importantly, it underscores a central truth of bodycam footage. The most consequential moments are often the earliest ones, when there is still a chance to choose a different path. With the arrest now formalized, the encounter enters its second phase, not calmer, but more controlled. This is where authority stops being contested in motion and instead becomes narrated. The officer, having secured physical dominance, begins to explain the justification for what has already occurred. This sequence is important because it reveals how power solidifies after escalation, and how narrative replaces dialogue once resistance is no longer possible. The reading of rights is delivered methodically, almost ceremonially. It signals a transition from confrontation to process. The officer's tone softens, but the imbalance remains absolute. The driver is now positioned not as a participant in an interaction, but as a subject within a system. The calmness here does not undo what preceded it. Instead, it reframes the encounter as orderly and inevitable. Immediately following this procedural step, the officer outlines the alleged reasons for the stop in a structured way. Loud music, a rolling stop at a red light. These claims are presented as settled facts, not as observations open to dispute. The timing matters. These explanations come after restraint, after commands have been enforced, after the driver's autonomy has been removed. In a legal sense, this inversion is significant. Justification is meant to precede enforcement, not follow it. This is a recurring pattern in contested stops. Once an arrest is made, the officer's task shifts to articulation, constructing a coherent narrative that aligns the events with legal standards. This does not require fabrication, it requires framing. The officer selects which details to emphasize and which to omit. The bodycam captures this process in real time, offering a rare window into how authority explains itself. The officer expands the scope further by introducing indicators of impairment. Observations about smell, appearance, speech, and behavior are listed in quick succession. Each observation reinforces the next, creating a cumulative impression of probable cause. Yet these indicators are inherently subjective. Smell can be ambiguous. Speech patterns can be influenced by stress. Appearance can be misread under artificial lighting and heightened tension. Behavior, especially after a physical confrontation, is rarely neutral. What is notable is that these observations are articulated after the driver has been forcibly detained. Stress responses are now indistinguishable from baseline behavior. The driver's agitation, confusion, and emotional state are no longer separable from the confrontation itself. This creates a feedback loop. Escalation produces stress. Stress is interpreted as impairment. Impairment justifies further escalation. When the officer asks the driver to perform roadside tests, the request is framed as optional, but the consequences of refusal are implicit. The driver declines. Legally, this is her right, but practically, it functions as confirmation in the officer's narrative. The refusal is not treated as neutral, it is treated as suspicious. The officer quickly moves to arrest for driving under the influence, citing the earlier observations and the refusal itself. This moment crystallizes a broader issue in enforcement culture: consent-based procedures that are technically voluntary but practically coercive. The choice offered is not between participation and neutrality, but between participation and escalation. When refusal leads directly to arrest, the voluntariness of the choice becomes questionable, even if it is legally permissible. The officer's confidence increases as the list of charges grows: resisting without violence, driving under the influence, traffic violations. Each charge adds weight to the encounter, making the initial escalation appear more justified in retrospect. This accumulation effect is powerful. It transforms a disputed stop into a multifaceted enforcement action, obscuring the original point of contention. Throughout this phase, the driver continues to assert that she did nothing wrong. Her statements are consistent, but they carry no force. In the logic of the encounter, innocence is irrelevant once authority has been challenged. The officer's repeated emphasis on compliance on the fact that she did not follow command serves as the moral core of the justification. The law becomes secondary to obedience. This is where the psychology of policing becomes most visible. Officers are trained to interpret non-compliance as risk. That training is rooted in safety concerns, but it can also create a default suspicion of any deviation from expected behavior. When a citizen does not behave as anticipated, does not remain in the vehicle, does not immediately submit to commands, the officer's threat assessment escalates rapidly. The driver's attempt to contextualize her actions to explain that she parked, that she did not believe she was fleeing, never alters the officer's stance. Explanation is treated as argument, and argument is treated as defiance. This dynamic leaves no space for mutual understanding. The encounter becomes a one-way assertion of authority. As the officer continues to speak, he references the presence of cameras repeatedly. This serves a dual purpose. It reassures the officer that his actions are documented, and it signals to the driver that contesting the narrative now is futile. The camera is invoked not as an impartial witness, but as an ally of enforcement. The implication is clear. The recording will support the officer's account. This reliance on the camera is revealing. Body cams are often promoted as tools of transparency, but their existence does not automatically produce accountability. Interpretation still matters. What the camera shows is filtered through reports, testimony, and institutional review. When an officer believes that the footage supports their actions, it can reinforce confidence rather than encourage reflection. The discovery that the driver's license is revoked introduces yet another layer. This information, obtained after the arrest decision, further solidifies the officer's sense of correctness. It becomes part of the narrative, even though it played no role in the initial escalation. This is another example of retrospective validation. Facts uncovered later are used to justify decisions made earlier. The officer's demeanor shifts again as he discusses these findings. There is an undercurrent of casualness, even familiarity. Comments about geography, accents, and background emerge. This tonal shift is striking. Moments earlier, the encounter was charged with urgency and command. Now, it resembles informal conversation. The contrast highlights how quickly demeanor can change once control is assured. This casualness, however, does not mitigate the power imbalance. The driver remains restrained, facing multiple charges, her vehicle impounded. The officer's relaxed tone underscores a troubling reality. The emotional intensity of enforcement is often asymmetric. What is a life-altering event for the citizen can become routine for the officer moments later. The officer recounts prior observations in detail, describing seeing the driver earlier and noting a drink. This retrospective narrative is delivered with certainty. It frames the encounter as the logical conclusion of earlier suspicion, even though those earlier observations did not prompt immediate action. The coherence of the story increases as it is told, but coherence does not necessarily equal accuracy. This is where institutional reinforcement plays a role. Officers are trained to articulate probable cause comprehensively, especially when charges are serious. This articulation is not inherently dishonest, but it is shaped by outcome. Once an arrest is made, the narrative tends to align with that outcome, smoothing over ambiguities and emphasizing corroborating details. The driver's continued assertions of innocence are now met with procedural responses. She is told she can argue in court. This is a common refrain, and it reflects a broader shift in responsibility. The officer's role is framed as complete. The burden now shifts to the judicial system. This compartmentalization allows officers to disengage from the moral weight of their actions. Yet the consequences of this encounter extend far beyond the roadside. Arrest, impoundment, charges, and court proceedings carry financial, emotional, and social costs. These costs are imposed regardless of the eventual legal outcome. Even if charges are reduced or dismissed, the process itself is punitive. What this part of the video illustrates is not just individual behavior, but systemic patterns. Escalation is rarely the result of a single decision. It emerges from a series of choices, each justified by the last. A command is issued, non-compliance is perceived, force is applied, justification is articulated. Additional charges are layered on. By the time the encounter ends, the original trigger is almost irrelevant. The officer's final interactions in this segment reinforce this sense of closure. Instructions are given, procedures continue. The driver is processed. The system moves forward. There is no acknowledgement of alternative paths, no reflection on whether the escalation was necessary. The narrative is fixed. This second part deepens the understanding established earlier. It shows how authority, once asserted, is maintained through narrative control. It reveals how legal thresholds are not just met, but constructed through articulation, and it underscores how easily the presence of multiple alleged violations can obscure the foundational question: was the escalation itself justified? As the documentary progresses, the focus shifts from the immediacy of the confrontation to its aftermath and implications. The encounter is no longer just about a traffic stop. It is about how systems respond to challenge, how authority defends itself, and how accountability is often deferred rather than addressed. The momentum continues, not through action, but through consequence. What began with a command has become a case, and the weight of that transformation is felt most by the person with the least power to influence it. By the time the encounter reaches its final phase, the outcome is no longer in dispute. The machinery of enforcement has fully engaged, and the remaining moments are about processing, justification, and closure. Yet it is precisely here, when the tension appears to dissipate, that the deeper implications of the encounter come into focus. What remains on the bodycam is not chaos, but normalization, the transformation of a volatile confrontation into routine procedure. The officer now operates entirely within institutional rhythm. Fingerprinting, movement through controlled spaces, short directives delivered without urgency. This calm is not a sign of resolution. It is a sign that the system has absorbed the incident. What was once contested is now categorized, labeled, and filed. The emotional intensity that marked the opening moments is replaced by procedural certainty. This transition is revealing. It demonstrates how quickly an encounter that felt unstable and unresolved can be rendered administratively complete. From the officer's perspective, the work is largely done. The narrative has been articulated, the charges identified, and the subject transferred into the next phase of the system. The complexity of the interaction is flattened into a sequence of boxes checked. For the driver, however, the experience does not flatten, it compounds. Each procedural step reinforces the reality of loss of freedom, autonomy, and voice. The questions she asked earlier about what she did wrong and why this was happening remain unanswered in any meaningful sense. They have simply been displaced by process. The officer's comments during this phase are casual, even conversational. References to geography, tone shifts toward mild familiarity, and remarks that might seem benign in isolation take on a different character in context. They highlight the asymmetry of stakes. What is an anecdote or observation for the officer exists alongside confinement and uncertainty for the person being processed. This asymmetry is not accidental, it is structural. Policing systems are designed to prioritize efficiency and control, often at the expense of reflection. Once an arrest is made, the focus shifts to throughput, moving the individual through intake, documentation, and transfer. There is little institutional incentive to revisit the earlier moments that set everything in motion. Yet those early moments are where the most significant decisions occurred. The choice to escalate commands rather than clarify. The choice to interpret movement as defiance. The choice to initiate physical control without resolving the central dispute about the nature of the stop. These decisions are not revisited during processing. They are treated as settled. This is how patterns of contested enforcement persist. Each individual case is absorbed into the system without challenging the assumptions that produced it. Officers are evaluated on adherence to procedure, not on whether escalation was avoidable. As long as the paperwork aligns with policy and the articulation meets legal thresholds, the encounter is considered valid. The officer's repeated confidence that everything is documented underscores this dynamic. Documentation becomes synonymous with legitimacy. But documentation is not neutral. It reflects the perspective of the person empowered to define events in the moment. The bodycam records actions, but interpretation remains contested, especially when the most consequential decisions occur rapidly and under stress. What is absent in this final phase is any acknowledgement of ambiguity. There is no space for uncertainty about whether the stop could have been handled differently. No recognition that the driver's understanding of the situation differed from the officer's. The system does not accommodate parallel interpretations, it resolves them by force and then records the resolution as fact. This rigidity has broader consequences. When citizens perceive that questioning authority leads inevitably to punishment, trust erodes. Compliance becomes less about cooperation and more about self-preservation. Encounters become more brittle, more prone to escalation, because both sides operate under assumptions shaped by prior experiences and institutional norms. The legal framework surrounding traffic stops and arrests is meant to provide guardrails against this outcome. Concepts like reasonable suspicion and probable cause are designed to constrain authority. But in practice, these concepts are often elastic. They expand to accommodate escalation rather than restrain it. Observations made after the fact are used to justify actions taken before clarity was established. In this encounter, the expansion is clear. What began as a dispute over a stop becomes a case involving multiple charges, each reinforcing the officer's authority. The original question whether the driver was lawfully detained at the moment she exited her vehicle fades into the background. It is overshadowed by subsequent findings and allegations. This does not mean those findings are irrelevant. It means they are contextualized within a process that rarely interrogates its own starting point. Even if later evidence supports enforcement action, it does not automatically validate the manner in which that action was initiated, yet the system often treats it as such. The officer's final interactions convey a sense of closure. Instructions are given, procedures completed, and the encounter concludes from the perspective of enforcement. The bodycam continues to record, but there is nothing left to decide. Authority has prevailed. The narrative is fixed. For viewers, however, the footage invites a different kind of reflection. It exposes the gap between legality and legitimacy. An action can be legally defensible and still feel unjust. A process can be followed correctly and still produce outcomes that undermine public trust. Bodycam footage does not resolve these tensions, it reveals them. This case illustrates how quickly control can replace communication, and how difficult it is to reverse that trajectory once it begins. It shows how officers, operating under training and institutional pressure, may default to command when faced with uncertainty. And it demonstrates how citizens, when they do not conform to expected behavior, can be swept into a system that prioritizes order over understanding. The most striking aspect of the encounter is not any single command or charge, but the absence of a pause. At no point does the interaction slow enough to allow recalibration. There is no moment where both parties realign their understanding of what is happening. Without that pause, escalation becomes self-sustaining. This is where accountability must focus not only on outcomes, but on process, on the early decisions that shape everything that follows, on the training that equates compliance with safety and challenge with threat, on the institutional narratives that reward articulation after the fact rather than restraint in the moment. The driver's experience, as captured here, is not unique. Similar patterns appear across countless bodycam videos. The details change, but the structure remains: a minor infraction or perceived violation, rapid escalation, contested authority, and a cascade of charges. Each case is treated individually, yet the repetition suggests a systemic issue. Addressing that issue requires more than cameras. It requires a cultural shift within enforcement, one that values de-escalation as much as control, and clarity as much as compliance. It requires recognizing that authority is most legitimate when it is explained, not merely enforced. As the video ends, there is no dramatic resolution. No courtroom verdict, no explicit reckoning. That absence is itself telling. Bodycam footage captures encounters, not outcomes. It shows us how power is exercised in moments of uncertainty, but it leaves unanswered questions about accountability and reform. What remains is the record, a sequence of decisions preserved in digital memory. For the officer, it is another incident, another file. For the driver, it is a defining event. And for the viewer, it is an opportunity to examine not just what happened, but how it happened, and why similar encounters continue to unfold in the same way. In the end, this documentary is not about assigning individual blame. It is about understanding dynamics, about recognizing how systems shape behavior, how authority responds to challenge, and how quickly the line between lawful enforcement and misuse of power can blur. The footage does not tell us what to think. It shows us what to notice. And what it reveals is a process that rarely stops to ask whether control was the only option, or whether clarity could have changed the course entirely.